Let's get more into details of the addiction piece. From, earlier in our conversation when it came up, the way I'm understanding it is addiction is basically along this dopamine continuum, but when you get to the more extreme piece of it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, it's a spectrum disorder. We define addiction as the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. It's associated with these physiologic manifestations of dependence, tolerance, withdrawal. In other words, a pleasure-pain balance that's gradually getting weighted to the side of pain and entering this kind of chronic dopamine deficit state, such that now the drug is needed just to feel normal. And when we're not using, we're in a kind of subthreshold or frank withdrawal. But the motivational and reward circuit that gets sort of engaged and goes awry in addiction is a circuit that we all have and that we need to survive. It's the reflexive way in which we approach pleasure and avoid pain. And as such, we're all potentially vulnerable to the problem of addiction with enough of our drug of choice and other circumstances conspiring. I really think that anybody could become addicted. And, speaking of drug of choice, that's an important concept because what might release a lot of dopamine in my brain might not release a lot of dopamine in your brain and vice versa. We all have our different drugs that we like. But one thing that's also true is that now we have new drugs that didn't exist before. So those sort of groups or people that were previously thought to be relatively immune to the problem of addiction, like people who don't particularly respond to the traditional legal drugs of nicotine, cannabis, alcohol. Now we've got folks who are getting addicted because they're getting addicted to romance novels. They're getting addicted to social media. They're getting addicted to pornography. They're getting addicted to online chess. They're getting addicted to cryptocurrency, right? They're getting addicted to work. So it's the drugification of all of these aspects of our lives, kind of creating just a larger net to catch people up in this process.
And when it comes to addiction, how much of it would you say is environmental versus genetic? And I know there's a lot of variance there, and that's a really complex question. But just to go there, at least briefly, let's talk about your opinion on that.
Well, the data suggests that about 50% of the risk is genetic and about 50% of the risk is environmental, experiential, contextual. So the genetic piece is based mainly on family studies showing that if you have a biological parent or grandparent with alcohol addiction, you are at increased risk to become an alcoholic yourself, even if raised outside of that alcoholic home. And so those are pretty powerful data to me. Suggesting that there's this inborn or innate vulnerability to addiction. And I've also treated many people, and most people have met people who just seem to have what used to be called the addictive personality, which is a term that we don't really use anymore. We now use sort of the disease of addiction language, but just this idea that some people are so vulnerable to the problem of addiction that they could get addicted to anything. So, for example, way back when, early in my career, I had a woman who was in recovery from an alcohol addiction, but she actually then got addicted to water because she discovered that if she drank enough water, she could make herself hyponatremic and altered. And so she would do that. So again, this idea that, even in the absence of this person's drug of choice, this person is so vulnerable to this addiction manifestation or phenomenology that they could get addicted to just about anything. Like, to me, water really captures that just about anything idea. Whereas other people might not be so vulnerable to the problem of addiction. This idea that most of us are now struggling with compulsive overuse of our devices and digital content, but we can kind of see it happening and we can sort of do some self-correction and sort of move on. It doesn't reach the threshold of actually interfering with our health, our goals, our relationships, our values. We're not going outside of our moral compass to find time to check our phones, right? Most of us are not doing that, but there is a subset of people who is struggling with that. So I think it's important to, acknowledge that this environmental risk has increased because of the increased access in the modern world to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, including drugs that didn't exist before, as well as increased potency of old drugs. So, for example, cannabis is much more potent today than it was, 40, 50 years ago. Opioids are much more potent than they were 200 years ago. Nicotine products are more potent and more available and come in all kinds of different delivery mechanisms compared to, even cigarettes 150 years ago. So
let's take that cannabis example and take it to the extreme where somebody's been using cannabis for years on a regular basis. It's clear by most that this person is addicted to that substance. So they've been using it, they've been getting their dopamine stimulation. They've needed more over time to get that same stimulation. Let's talk about working their way back. Let's give people hope that have pushed it to that limit. And you alluded to something earlier where the brain can over time work its way back. So let's go from addicted brain back to quote unquote normal brain and talk about what that process looks like when people start to wean off of whatever they're addicted to.
Yeah. So, first of all, there's lots of hope. People are recovering from addiction all the time. There are millions of people all over the world in long-term recovery from addiction, leading really rich and wonderful lives and making amazing contributions, to the world and to their families and friends and et cetera. So lots of reason for hope. If you think about it from the perspective of the biology or the neurocircuitry, the first step is to restore a level balance or homeostasis. Because when people are in this constant state of craving, it's really impossible to be able to have the energy and focus to do much of anything else in our lives. So one of the obvious ways to restore level balance is to abstain from our drug of choice for long enough for our body to get the memo that it needs to start upregulating its own endogenous dopamine production and get levels, baseline levels of dopamine firing back to normal. And so that is really where we start with many patients, is that we ask them to abstain from their drug of choice for long enough, which is usually to start a month, for dopamine reward pathways to reset themselves. Now, a couple caveats. We would not ask somebody who had tried repeatedly to stop on their own and was unable to do this. We would want to support that person with a higher level of care, for example, a residential treatment facility where they didn't have access to their drug for at least 30 days so that they could get their brain back online. We also wouldn't ask this of somebody who was at risk for a life-threatening alcohol or benzo withdrawal. But for somebody with a cannabis addiction, you can safely stop, and withdrawal is not life-threatening. It can be really uncomfortable, but it's not life-threatening. Same thing with a pornography addiction or a video game addiction, which, by the way, is often characterized by physical symptoms of withdrawal. People don't really appreciate that, but people can have real physical pain with those behavioral addictions when they stop. But whatever it is, we ask folks to stop, knowing that initially they'll feel worse before they'll feel better. They'll go into withdrawal. But if they can just abstain for long enough, i.e. 3 to 4 weeks, typically that is enough time for the beginning of a reset reward pathway. And when that happens, it's really exciting because people are then begin to have the sense of being freed from the constant intrusive cravings of wanting to use. They're also able to experience pleasure from more modest rewards, dinner with friends, watching a sunset, going for a walk, things that we lose the ability to take pleasure in when we're in our addiction, because what happens is our focus comes very narrowly upon just our drug of choice. And that's the only thing that we want to do and the only thing that gives us pleasure. So you get this widening again of the lens with abstinence and the ability to do other things and activities without using our drug and to actually enjoy them. And so I think that's a key message for patients. Patients really feel like, well, either I'm going to be using my drug, which is, eventually makes everybody miserable, but it's either that or I stop using and I'm going to be miserable. I'd rather use and be miserable. So what I always try to tell people is it's not just between being miserable using or being miserable not using. There's this third option where you can come out of this place of misery if you can, abstain for long enough. I also want to just add that, for opioid addiction, we often use opioids to treat opioid addiction. And what we're doing there is we're not like giving our patients opioids so they can go get high. We're basically acknowledging that some people just simply may not be able to abstain for long enough to reset reward pathways, or maybe that balance is broken. Maybe no amount of abstinence is actually going to restore homeostasis for some individuals. So when we're using things like methadone maintenance, what we're doing is we're giving them a medication that allows them to reset reward pathways so that they can then begin to engage in other types of recovery work.
As you talk about using a drug there as a means of overcoming an addiction, it gets me thinking about supplements and natural things that we could give patients. I'm curious, are there any natural, nutritive supplements that can be helpful when somebody is coming off an addiction?
I don't know anything about supplements. I'm just going to say that up front. I didn't learn about supplements in medical school, don't use them in my clinical practice. Haven't read the evidence on them one way or another. So I'm not informed about supplements.
And I can imagine as somebody, if you're working with a patient and they are, again, working out of an addiction, one thing you'd have to be really wary of is making sure they're not, subbing that cannabis out and then finding that dopamine high through a video game. I can imagine a lot of people, whether they're conscious or not, it would be easy enough to substitute out one addiction for another.
Yeah, so this is something that we always have to counsel patients about as they give up their drug of choice, particularly if they're using other drugs simultaneously, which is common. So we'll have patients who both drink and smoke cigarettes. And many times they are willing or wanting help with stopping drinking because drinking has interfered in more obvious ways in their relationships and their work and in their parenting or what have you. But they don't want to give up smoking, right? Or they don't feel able to. And that's okay because you can still get the benefits of just giving up one drug, even if you're continuing to use another, as long as you don't increase use of that other drug. So we have to talk a lot about cross addiction and how about all drugs basically work on the same common reward pathway. So if you're going to give up alcohol but keep smoking, you don't want to increase your consumption of cigarettes or cannabis or whatever it is, or you don't want to add in something else like a cookie or start binge watching Netflix or video games, right? Because of this potential for cross addiction.
If you enjoyed that, click here for more great content on how to improve your health and your life. I'll see you over there.
If you're living inside a cage, it's made out of rice paper, and I know that it looks real, the bars look real, they're not real. You're a microsecond away from whee!